Good day, good day, good day. Episode 20 of the Everyday Dog. Been a while. That's like 20 weeks of being consistent, and I'm having some feedback here in a second. There we go. Anyhow, today there's a few things I want to talk about, okay? Collar choices, harness, head, prong, fill your whatever, fill the blank. Biggest walking error I see that contributes to dogs pulling on walks. Also going to dispel some leadership things that people commonly kind of think matter that in my experience don't. We'll get started with that. So to begin with, it's commonplace where people are like, what kind of apparatus should I walk my dog with? And I'm like, well, it doesn't really matter to me. Whatever typically makes that handler feel the most confident and comfortable. Now, with saying that, there are some things that are beneficial as far as like training collars and so forth that aid in conveying to the dog, I don't want you to pull, for example. So the first thing I'll mention is that I'm 6'3". I'm a larger human, so my personal preference is to use like a head collar or a front clip harness or a regular flat buckle collar. Some people would prefer to use like a slip collar or like a choke chain, which is essentially the same thing. It's just one's a chain and one is just fabric leash that goes around, kind of like a noose, or a prong collar or a pinch collar. Prong, pinch, same thing. But in any event, I'm fairly large, so I don't tend to use those two last examples I mentioned because there can be quite a bit of downside to them. But at the same point, I'm like respectful of like not everyone's a monster like me. So it's not a place for me to judge. I just want to help my clients feel confident and competent that they're not going to like get dragged down the street by their dog, so they feel safe enough to practice the tactics that I would implement. So to explain a little bit more about like something I like, for example, not so much the traditional harness. I mean, it's okay if you want your dog to pull a little bit. It really is not a big deal. It's just that if you're trying to work on your dog not pulling, a traditional harness doesn't tend to be very beneficial in comparison to a pull deterrent one, a front clip one. Because when you do the tactic that I tend to encourage people to do, which is at times simply just stopping and backing up when your dog pulls, because what happens with a front clip is their whole body turns and they look back at you like, oh yeah, you exist. Whereas the back clip one, the dog does like the zombie walk and they keep moving forward or looking forward rather while you're backing up and pulling them back. So the front clip is different in the sense of it's very simple. And this one is called a sensation harness. Very simple. It's just got a clip that goes there, but basically it goes over the head, clips on the chest with the dog, and then these two straps clip underneath their two front legs. And it fits in a like semi-snug capacity. You don't want it sagging too much because then the dog can pull its paw out. But these are my favorite ones, and the only place that I know really that sells them anywhere local is the Moose Jaw Humane Society. So if you want to fancy yourself getting a front clip pull deterrent harness that will assist with minimizing the impact on your body, but also teaching your dog to not pull as much, definitely check in with them. We also do have an 11-minute complimentary training video on loose leash walking in our closed group, the Everyday Dog Training Secrets, that you, if you're not part of yet, you can join. But it's under the guides tab, and I think it's guide 6. You'll find it easily if you're part of the group, but that can help you with that as well. Front clip harness. Okay. Other thing is if your dog is larger, so like if you got a mastiff or something and you're like not a real big human, I'm like front clip harness probably not going to be enough. You might want to do something like a head collar, which is essentially just something that goes over their face. You have to be careful because obviously you don't want to put a lot of pressure and be jerky with it because I don't want to like impact the neck. But it works under the premise of like a halter on a horse. If you move the head, the body will follow. So then it becomes less strenuous on the handler to, handle their large breed, medium breed, or whatever size dog that might be a little bit more abrupt on leash with a head collar. So basically, here is an example of one. So really just pretend this is the dog mouth. It goes on through here. Okay. And then this piece goes behind and it clips on the back of the dog's head. So it sits kind of high at the back of the dog's head. You've got an extra clip here to go just onto the collar. And then this is where you would clip your leash to. So then when they're moving ahead like this, and then they pull, it turns their face. Dogs aren't super fans of these, FYI. And it's just because it's on their face and they're like, this is annoying. They're not used to having anything on their face. So there is like some work that has to be put in to teach them to not fight these. And some dogs will never really like it, but they are a lot more manageable for certain people on leash. So it is what it is. You just kind of get over it. Whereas like a prong collar would be easier to just initially affix because the dog's been accustomed to having something around their neck. But anyways, regardless of the tool that you're using, especially when it's a prong or a head collar, is like ultra sensitivity, and don't be rough. I teach clients all the time when we're using this, I'm like, ask the dog for what you want. Don't just drag them around with this. Because what can happen is the dog becomes resistant to you physically overpowering them. And lots of times I've just noticed through the years, I'm like, hey, let's go this way, friend. And they're like, okay, fine. But if I physically drag them and start to pull, they kind of get that back up and slow down against it. So really, some of it is just trying to determine what is going to work best for you and your situation. But for example, especially if you have a dog who is like reactive or threatening on leash towards other dogs, is I prefer something like a front clip harness, a regular collar, or a head collar, just because they don't tend to, add any physical pain. Because like, for instance, if your dog has an underlying fear of dogs, let's say it got attacked on leash once, and then, your dog's outlandish on leash and you're like, hey, well, my friend told me I should get a prong collar. And then you try it out and maybe it seems to work a little bit at first because the dog is slowing down and not pulling as much because it's physically painful. But what can happen through a handful of repetitions is the dog actually starts to associate more pain with the visual stimulus of the other dogs, because that's when they pull, right? They see the dog, they start getting, and then they pull, and then the pressure goes on their throat. And while they're looking at it, it's called classical conditioning, basically. The dog makes an association with what they're looking at with a feeling. So they see the other dog, because I did this with one of my dogs, okay? Except I would punish her with a slip lead. So I do like a side leash pop. Not proud of it. Don't do that anymore in that capacity with dogs, because I know the downside of it, because I created a bigger issue with my own dog. But essentially what I was doing was not addressing the underlying root fear of the issue, because she was under socialized. So she was scared. She was just acting more fighty than flighty. So then when I'd physically punish her, well, she was already staring at that thing. So now not only was that thing dangerous, but she felt more amped up, and it was even more dangerous than before, because now I was providing physical pain associated with what she was looking at, which the dogs can do with the prong collar just by pulling. You don't even intend to do it. It's just like you're like do walking, and then your dog pulls to go see another dog, and it's friendly at first, and you're like, no, get back here, and you pull it back. And sometimes what they'll do is they'll learn to associate, oh, when I see dogs, it hurts. And some dogs will pull less, and some dogs will pull more, because they're like, oh my God, I got to get that thing away. I don't like it. I don't know why. But it's that classical conditioning in a negative sense, that the dog associates pain with the visual stimuli of another dog, for example. So there's just a little bit more to consider when you're working with these cases. Is like, for me, anytime I'm working with that, my preference is, a head collar or a front clip harness or a regular collar if I'm working with a dog who's reactive on leash. I mean, but like I said, it's really mostly about like what makes the person feel the most comfortable and mitigating risk to try to make sure that there is no negative downside and wear and tear with the methods that we're using. and what we're working towards. So since the head collar, as long as you're not like leash popping your dog or being really rough with it, it provides the person more control, with less exertion from their self, but it's more of like an annoyance to the dog than physical pain. So if I have my dog on a head collar and it's pulling because it wants to go see the other dog, I don't feel like it is as negatively impactful as a prong could be. So either way, I'm not trying to utilize what makes you feel the most confident. I used to be a lot more like, I don't advocate for them ever and blah blah blah, but it's just through the years I've realized that if people are gentler with them and if it makes them feel more confident, that's mostly the biggest importance. So it's really just like I said 3 times, if you're feeling more comfortable with the device, you're going to act differently and your dog's going to follow you differently. So I'm like, fine, like utilize it if it makes you feel more competent. Anyway, so that's that. Don't forget to hashtag live if you're watching this live, and replay if it's on a replay. But I'll move on to the next thing. So, walking error. Okay, this is maybe in my video, but whatever. It's been a constant theme in the last handful of sessions I've been at. The biggest walking error that I see for people that want their dog to walk on a loose leash. Now, between you and I don't care if your dog pulls on leash or not. I want to support you in with whatever you want. So if you want your dog to not pull on leash, cool. If you don't care, it doesn't really bother me either. So in any event, for the people that want their dog to not pull and or pull less, there's a very, like, you have to be mindful of this particular thing. And this is your dog pulling to go sniff and or pee on things. So it's one of the most common things I notice, that people unintentionally reinforce their dog, reward the dog with their pulling, because the dog pulls to go sniff something or it pulls to go and to pee on something. Now, what I want to do is put some context in front of this. So, you might consider that this could be true, what I'm saying. And the context is, if you consider that dogs learn by trial and error, and like think of like they just walk through life being like, hey, does this work? Hey, does this work? Oh, that works. I should do that again. So then when they're pulling maybe 3, 5, 10 times a walk, and you're like, no, stop it, and you reset them. And then they pull again, no, stop it, and then you reset them. And then they pull again, and you're like, okay, fine, you can go sniff this. You're actually rewarding a variable schedule of reinforcement, which means the dog is perceiving, I have to pull 5 times to sniff 2 things. Okay, copy that. So they'll actually pull more and more and more, because it's like they think, I got to pull as many times as it takes, and then you're going to let me sniff. So I'm like, stop, like, because this is interesting to me, because I've seen a lot of clients do it. And sometimes, like, it was only a couple of years ago where I was like, what is going on here? When I was working with a client who had a very well-trained dog, but she kept having to reset the dog more times than she wanted to, which was actually a lot of times, on walks. And I was trying to be like, well, why does she heel awesome like 50, 60, 70% of the time, but then that other portion, the dog just keeps pulling? And the reason was because it was like 9 out of 10 times pulling got her nowhere. But that one time when she pulled, then the handler is like, yeah, okay, fine, go sniff or go pee. And I was like, oh, that's it. The dog is like operating from a standpoint in their mind of like, okay, now can I? And they lead with pulling, which is the trial. And the person's like, no, get back. And like, okay. And they're like, what now? Now can I? And anyways, so what I would prefer and suggest you do, if you want this to be beneficial for your dog and your walks to be less pulley, is that I would just be the one who's like, go sniff, but make sure the dog was not pulling before you offer the opportunity to go sniff and or pee. I don't care how many times you do at a walk, but just you're in front of that decision. So like, for example, you're walking down the street, your dog pulls 5 times to go to like a tree on the other side of the path or other side of you, and you reset them, you put them back, and then they do 5 times, 6 times. Okay, you just keep walking, and then they're finally like, and you're like, say your dog's name, because that's like the pay attention to me cue, because we talk too much, just saying, so they don't know when to listen to us. So I'm like, Jasper, and I gesture, go pee or go sniff. And I like kind of have my hand towards their face, and then I lead them to the tree or this place they may want to sniff. And then they sniff for a little bit, and they either get tired of the spot or I get tired of waiting. And then we're like, let's go. And we leave again. So that way, if you have 10 out of 10 times pulling does not get the dog access to sniff or pee on something, then they're going to start to be like, wait a second, like walking beside you gets me access to go and sniff. So then they'll start to walk beside you more, and they'll start to pull less because you're not unintentionally rewarding a cycle of behavior that you didn't want. And that's what you're doing when you let your dog pull and then you give them access to what they wanted. Cycle complete. They're thinking pull, sniff, or pull, sniff. So anyways, there's always a big discrepancy in my experience between what people believe their dog understands from what they're doing versus what the dog actually understands. And I know this from my personal experience as well, because I've worked with a lot of dogs, and I've had a lot of dogs not understand what the hell I wanted. And the reason I knew they didn't understand is because they didn't do what I wanted. And I was like, why are they not doing it? And a big portion of the time is because I was actually not aware of how they learned or their interpretation of what was happening. I was applying what like it would make sense to me if you like, duh, not realizing that that's not how they were thinking. So consider this stuff. It really is simple. I'll give you another tip too about the walking is try to not talk so much to them. So when you reset the dog, okay, here's another thing, a few more. So you're walking your dog, you're going down the street, they pull ahead. Typically what I'll do is I'll stop and I'll back up 5 to 15 feet until they're walking with me backwards. And I'll guide them back to the side that I've chosen, which is another thing. It's probably ideal to choose a side and stick with it for the time being. Once the dog's good at it, you can flip-flop between both sides. But just when you're beginning to try to establish somewhat of a routine during your walk is like, let's say the dog walks on the right side. I don't care. Neither do they, FYI. That's another one. Dogs must walk on the left. They don't give two shits, and neither do I. Competition obedience style, more like left to the side, but it really makes no difference in my experience for the dog. It's your personal comfort. And some people just like the dog to be on their dominant hand side. So the next piece of that would be, I got my dog on my left or right. Let's say it's the right. Okay, we're walking, dog pulls ahead, I stop, I back up 5 to 15 feet to reset the dog. I'm not saying anything after we start moving forward again. Think of trial and error. What am I conveying? I'm conveying red light, green light. You pull forward, I stop, and we back up away from the thing that you're pulling towards, and then we move forward. Green light, we'll keep walking if you just don't drag me around everywhere. Piece number 2 or 3, I don't even know what I'm at, but if the dog pulls to the left, I just gently pull in the leash and then I release the tension on the leash. So sometimes I'll be holding 2 grips and I shorten the leash, I pull the dog in and then I release the tension so they've got their like 3 to 4 feet of leash. Another thing to not be overly sensitive about is the position of your dog. My preference is like giving them 3 to 4 feet of the leash and just being like, this giant rectangle on this side is yours. You don't have to put your dog in like a tight heel beside your leg. You can, but essentially what I try to help people understand, I'm like, are you restraining the dog in a heel, or is the dog actually heeling with a loose leash? And the most of the time they are restraining the dog in a heel and the leash is taut. So you're not actually teaching them that much. My preference is to teach heel like a muscle, building up a muscle, because it's difficult to do. It's like a plank. I don't know if you know what a plank is, but those things are hard. 15, 30 seconds, 45, you're like, holy shit, this is hard. So, but if you did a little bit more each day and each week, you could get a lot stronger over time. So anyways, with that, my dog pulls to the side. I rein the dog back in, but I'm not saying anything when I do this. Don't bother being like, hey, quit it. No, walk nice, walk nice, walk nice. Heel, heel, heel. Because it's just going to frustrate you. The more times you repeat yourself, you know, with a like walk nice or something, typically in my experience, people just tend to get more abrupt. Hey, quit it. Walk nice. That's enough. Stop it. So I'm like, just don't talk, because you will probably not feel as mentally bothered if you don't say something each time. It's like asking your child to brush their teeth 7 times. By the 7th time you ask them, you're ready to brush their throat for them. I'm not saying that you would, but I've felt that way myself and be like, why am I, bickering and badgering my son to do this? I'm just going to not leave to where he wants to go till he brushes his teeth. Anyway, so talk less. Each time I reset, I don't say anything. Okay. My dog goes to the opposite side. I just pull them back over to my same left side, and then I drop the tension. You really got to think about this as conditioning. They're not just constantly being like, hey, what do you want? They're just gonna be like, what's that? What's that? And their natural tendency is to go and investigate. And you have to be like, no, stop, and then put them back. So you're conditioning them to walk on your right, for example. So it just takes more reps than what people think it should. So anyways, I think you got the point of that. You can see videos to facilitate this, or a video, in our closed Facebook group, The Everyday Dog. I'll probably wrap it up at that because I went a little over with the walking intro, but I guess I'll slip in a few leadership myths that I think are complete BS from my experience, of course. When I first started dog training, there's so much information out there about like how to show leadership or dominance or whatever. I like leadership because I have a negative association with the word dominance, that I feel like people believe that you have to assert yourself through physical force to acquire this dominant position, which is not true in my perspective. Anyhow, with the leadership, some stuff is like, hey, your dog should never walk out the door before you, because if they walk out or if they walk in front of you, they're going to think that they're in control. And I'm like, man, that's kind of true, but like, to begin with, I don't believe it is true in a sense. Okay, so if I'm on a walk and my dog is ahead of me, in other regards, the dog I have had lots of dogs, and they'll listen to me when I tell them to. So they're not thinking like, oh, I'm taking over the world because I'm walking ahead of you like this. I'll run this shit. It doesn't really work like that. And leaving out the front door, I don't feel is the same thing. Now, I do think it's important that people get their dog to sit and stay when they open the front door, and then gesture them to leave, from like an impulse control standpoint of your dog just not bolting out a door anytime they see it's open. But I wouldn't categorize that as leadership per se. I would categorize that as like impulse control of like, cool your jets, bro. It's no different than you would teach your child to not run into the middle of the street so they don't get run over, right? You're like I'm trying to just convey to them, don't do that. This is a safer way to go. So there's one, okay? Your dog can walk in front of you and not think they're taking over the world. Doesn't mean I don't like heel, I do. But anyway, another leadership myth is like, sometimes I've heard people mention that, you should never clean up your dog's poop when they can see it, because they'll think that they're in charge. I'm like, well, how do you like verify that? And I've cleaned up lots of dogs' poop in front of them and they still listened to me. So I'm using more of a litmus of like, when things get spicy and intense, does the dog listen to me? Is like my leadership strong enough there? Yes. Okay. Well, that this cleaning up their poop in front of them clearly is not changing their perspective of me. When I ask them to do something, they still do it. Another one is eating before them. You got to eat before your dog so the dog knows that they're subordinate and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, it doesn't matter as much as people think, in my experience, because sometimes it's just not convenient to eat before them. So I'm like, no, I don't know. I'm going to feed them whenever I want. Like, they'll eat before me if I want them to. But I also feel like, yeah, like you should have some parameters and structure around feeding. Like, when I'm eating, stay away from me. Lay in the other room when I'm sitting at the table eating, because I just don't like dogs drooling on my legs. So I still think there's important stuff, and I'm a big firm believer in leadership, but there's also things in my experience that I tried because I've done all this stuff. And then I'm like, I don't think this makes any fucking difference at all. So what's another one? I don't know, I'm drawing a blank with some of these leadership myths, but what I'll give you is just a quick little insight as to what my interpretation of good leadership looks like from a human to a dog. And in my experience, really, it's conditioning. So like, if you get, once again, consider dogs learn by trial and error, and your dog is like initiating behavior from you, like pet me, ruff, 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 and then you pet them. They bring you a toy and you throw it for them. Maybe the pet one is 5 to 10 times a day. And then they bring you a toy and you throw it for them 5 to 10 times a day. Then they initiate behavior from you, like by scratching at the door or barking at it, and you get up and you let them outside. Or they jump on and off couches at their own free will, and you walk around them instead of through them with an expectation of them to move, but you're walking around them around the house. Like, these things can add up to anywhere from like 15 to 50 repetitions per day that the dog is like kind of having an impact on you doing something for them. And then I ask the dog to sit 3 times before its meal. You see the discrepancy? So it's almost like, in most cases, in my experience, people unintentionally condition the dog to be a little bit pushy or a lot pushy. Not intentionally, but it just comes from a place of being kind and considerate. And you're like, oh, I just want to do whatever you want. It's fine. You want some pets? Oh, okay. And I get it. I mean, I've done it. I've done all these things. But then I started to see some like patterns, and I'm like, wait a second, the dog, like, because I've seen dogs growl at people that they enjoy when the people go to pet them, and they're like, why is my dog growling at me? And I'm like, I don't know. And then I watch and I'm like, oh, the dog doesn't want it then. They're like, no, I'm good, get away from me. So I was like, okay, I think you need to reorganize this leadership and put your affection on your terms, not the dog's. So then once you start to be the one, like, I can still give my dog all these things, going outside, pets. I'm not trying to starve them of any of it. All I want to do is make sure that I wait until it's my decision. So dog comes up and paws me, I'm like, I just blow them off. And then they go and lay down for like 30 seconds. And I'm like, hey, you want to go outside? And they're like, yeah, okay. When you start to implement this stuff and you're the one who's prompting the dog more than it's prompting you, then the dog starts to associate you as kind of like this thing, like, may I? Could I? And they just start to stare at you more, like waiting for you to give them a cue of some form, because they've associated that it makes sense to listen to you because they get what they want. Dogs, in my experience, do not necessarily very often intrinsically want to please us. So if your dog does not do everything you want, don't feel bad. It's kind of, that's a myth too that I've heard, where your dog like wants to please you. I'm like, fuck, where are all these dogs? Some, yeah, but those are the exceptions, not the like rule. But we can teach our dogs to want to please us or do things that we want by helping them associate that if they listen to me, they get what they want. And that's how I can do this, through this daily conditioning of flipping the script, essentially. I'm going to pet you when I call you or you're laying down. I'm going to play ball with you when I decide it's time to play tug or whatever. I'm going to tell you to go outside. Oops. And so on. So anyways, I hope that's brought some light onto a few things that sometimes are confusing about knowing how to navigate, with dogs on walks and just general leadership and all the rest. So you have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you with episode 21 next week. Good night or afternoon. Good day.